all right, this works a lot better. That's the upside of getting a new laptop which you haven't tested before. Sometimes it doesn't really work. But I will talk about mixed reality and the issues I faced when beginning as a VR developer and then moving on to mixed reality later on, because there are quite some differences and some are tricky, some are trivial to fix, but it can definitely be an issue. So first of all, who am I? I'm Dylan. I got my own immersive XR studio where I do some freelancing, some projects, also some workshops soon, and there I'm busy most of the time. And my background was originally in game development, so I studied at the HKU in Utrecht. And during that bachelor, I moved on to more XR type of projects, which I fell in love with and I kept doing ever since. To give some background on my experience with XR, I started using XR with a VR headset, the Oculus Rift. I think most of you know about it. And that was just as a consumer, but during my bachelor I found out that you can actually make games for it, and that's awesome. And around the time the Quest 1 launched, I started getting into development. With the Quest 3, I gave more into the mixed reality development, which opened up a lot of new doors. And for me, it's Unity all the way. It's just the tool I prefer working with, and it's probably one I'm going to stick with. And here I do mostly the development, the design, and also the more graphics and technical art side, because it's fun to tackle all the performance problems. And very important for this talk is what my definition of mixed reality is, since that varies from person to person. And for this talk, mixed reality for me is having an HMD on you, like the Quest 3, and it is using camera pass-through to basically see the real world and interact with it. I will also be covering glasses with digital overlay. Technically, according to these definitions, it would be AR, but since the interactions are the same, I'll be focusing that on mixed reality. If I'm talking about VR, it's just an HMD with a fully immersive environment. And for augmented reality, if I mention that, that will be a phone with camera with an overlay, which, again, according to the definition, also is the glasses, but for this talk, that will be mixed reality. A really important part of mixed reality is how you interact with it, because if you're just looking at an image, that's not interesting at all. And the fun thing is, images like this usually aren't that accurate, because if you look for virtual reality or mixed reality online, you get something like this, someone with a phone on their face, which doesn't use hand tracking, controller tracking, it doesn't even have the 6 degrees of freedom, and I want to make that contrast that current hardware can do that, and this is still how people see mixed reality or VR. It's just having a phone strapped to your face, so that's something to always be aware of. And that it does offer 6 degrees of freedom. You can look around, but more importantly, you can move around the world. You can walk around a table if you're interacting with something on it, which adds a lot of immersion there. And also, controllers versus hand tracking is always a difficult issue because controllers have been around for longer, so more applications are made for them. But hand tracking does get a lot more accessible. But it is different to get into, and development is very different, and it does depend on the age and the experience. So I made a very big graph on some very accurate opinions of me. And this is basically controller skills. Younger people pick it up very quickly, but especially older people sometimes run into issues. They just don't get the abstraction there. And here's a beautiful overlay with hand tracking. Some people can do more with controllers than hand tracking, especially if you use it or if you're using it for years. It is just easy to get around with controllers. But for people who are new to VR, mixed reality, hand tracking is very trivial to get into, since you can just, pick something up and you don't have to press a button, which you might never have done before. So when working with mixed reality, that's the first thing. If it's stationary, it is usually better to go with hand tracking for that. And also quickly to get into why MR it matters. For many people, it's more accessible. It's not like you're putting on a headset in a completely different world you don't know, but you're there where you're at. You can see your environment. You can still see people, which if you're demonstrating projects is very nice. And you have a bit more the interaction with the real world there. So it's easy to get into. And for some people, it's even more immersive, which might sound a bit counterintuitive since, in VR, it's fully immersive. But once you are focusing on something which isn't necessarily all around you, so if there's a science experiment on the table, if it's inside of your own room, it is more immersive to get into what you're actually doing, since you don't have to see a whole chemistry lab to do one science experiment. And for many people, it's just more practical to work with it. For example, for some augmentations from Meta, you can see there, you can just have something on the wall instead of having a huge view in front of you for something as simple as checking the weather. And there are a lot of opportunities here for entertainment in pretty much all industries, and that depends on the exact use case, of course. Now, what makes designing for mixed reality hard? There are quite some things. First of all, it's not VR, so there aren't any infinite worlds. And if you're used to that, designing with infinite worlds, and if something is higher up, well, just scale up the player. You're not going to do it in mixed reality because that doesn't really work. So you really have to take into account the limitations of where you're currently standing and where the players or users might be standing. And that's also the thing where you're standing. Every room is different. Some rooms have a lot of tables. Some people have a 1 meter play space. For some people, 3 meters. And you really need to take that into account, which is difficult. And some more on that later. But one of the things for furniture is if you can transform furniture, like the demo shown here, that is really great since you can still touch physical objects, but you see them virtually. So it really gives another layer of immersion that the stuff you see you actually can touch. So if you can get away with that, that's great. And also for every room is different. Laser dance on the right. Wait, that's left for you guys. That's great since they're making a procedural way to dodge obstacles, which is very promising since it should work in every room. Even if your room is small, then you just have a different layout of lasers. And of course, users, everyone does it differently. Some people pick up stuff slowly. Some people just keep throwing objects for half an hour. If you've demoed projects before, you probably know what happens. That's also something to take into account, that everyone interacts with the object differently. And that's something that should be taken into account. And for the design, it's best to work with it and not against it. Don't try to make infinitely scalable worlds in mixed reality because you are going to run into a lot of issues. And the mixed reality does offer a lot of extra options, like you can interact with the new world using scans of the real world with the Quest 3 and the Pico 4 Ultra do. You can touch objects and you can interact with it, like you can see on the top here. That's a demo I made where you can slap on the ground, and the harder you slap, the higher pitch of a noise there is, and particles spawn all around the world. And using that, you can have physical interaction with the real world with a digital augmentation on it. So that's a room collider or a depth map. You can portal to the digital world. This is Starship Home, a great mixed reality game where you can make portals into basically space and transform your room into a starship. And it's also one of the things that if you're facing issues with what players can or cannot do, to have the players place objects themselves. So you don't have to take into account every possibility and people can just put it them themselves. And of course you can, as said before, replace the real world with digital objects, which does work very great. For more the technical side, even though not everyone here might be technical, this is still good to know if you're in a managing position or working with a lot of technical people. Development can be quite tricky. This is an overview from Unity, how they make everything. And you have a whole lot of plugins which you need to know pretty much for which headsets they are. Then it goes into the SDK, there are subsystems which automatically are used by the Extra Interaction Toolkit or other SDKs. And sometimes you need to access subsystems. And if you're using mixed reality, you also need to import Augmented AR Foundation for any MR devices. And it can be a bit all over the place and hard, and especially since it is rapidly changing. There are some initiatives like OpenXR which are actually working quite well and adding a lot of features to standardize this, but it's not there and you will be running into many SDKs from Meta or Pico, which all have slightly different workflows, which can be quite rough. There are sometimes feature incompatibilities like making a 3D mesh of the room. Meta, you need to do this beforehand. Pico does this on the fly. For AR, iOS does this on the fly, and with Android it doesn't officially work, but if you use some other plugins it does work. So it's a lot of different implementations which you just need to take into account. And also there is rapid innovation. As good as it is, as a developer, sometimes it just kind of sucks that there's a new feature that changes everything. You need to upgrade your project. It takes 2 weeks to fix it again. It just takes a lot of time. And also there are new sensors like eye tracking, which completely change the way you interact with the digital world. And while it can be a lot more intuitive, it does take time to adjust to it, and that's something that needs to take into account. So for here, using standards like OpenXR, if it's supported by the headsets, can be an easier way to port to different devices, if you're okay with sometimes losing 1 or 2 features. And here, before the time runs out, some of the key findings I'm doing in primarily mixed reality design is to first find a safe space for your content. So whenever you're placing something, you can get the mixed reality room information, like, oh, this is a table, this is a monitor, then I need to place it onto the table where there isn't a monitor. And then there are some physics backends to make sure it doesn't overlap with any other objects. So the demo on the top is some objects which automatically are placed onto the table, which is fairly simple. And then to make sure that the user can actually see what's happening, you can spawn the UI you can see up there. You can spawn that in front of the player a bit up, so it doesn't interact with the table, so it doesn't include it. And that's just great so the user can always see what is happening. Also, occlusion and shadows are very important for mixed reality because this adds a lot of depth. You can see right here that if your hand is in front of a 3D object, you can still see your hand, which isn't the default. By default, the 3D object will be overlaid and you cannot even see your own hands. So having occlusion in there is very important. And also shadows is something which we'll cover in the next slide. It adds a lot of depth to it since, well, objects have shadows. And if it's not there, it's hard to estimate the depth for that object. And also, of course, take into account different rooms require a minimal play space if possible, since, well, some people have very small rooms, and while there might be a big room, if there's a huge bed in the middle, you're still going to run into difficulties. So if you want to place something on the table's not there, you can place something to the ground, or, as said before, have the users place it themselves, which is another step, but it is very accessible to not have just the objects drop into randomness and the user has to find them. And here's a small video on how shadow matters. This is one of the assets I made for the Unity Asset Store, which renders quite high resolution shadows onto the real world. The contrast is a bit funky on this television, but that aside, it adds a lot of depth to your experiences. So for now, that was the talk. If people have any struggles for mixed reality or whatnot, just reach out via the QR codes or in person. For people collecting business cards, I also still have those. And thank you for showing up.